Started. And I see that you've started the recording, so thank you for that. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Teresa Delgado. I'm the chair of the Religious Studies Department, and I'm also a member of the Week of the Peacemaker Committee. And so on behalf of the Week of the Peacemaker Committee, I welcome you to this event. And it's titled Shaking Our Values, Moral, Legal, and Epistemic Challenges from the COVID-19 Pandemic with our very own Dr. Alex Eodice. And before I turn it over to him, actually to our to Catherine Bruning, who's going to lead us in a brief meditation, I'd just like to give you a sense of what this Week of the Peacemaker is all about. Each year, the college devotes time, usually it's prior to Veterans Day, to the study and analysis of a theme that is related to peace and justice. So this week at Iona honors the memory and sacrifice of veterans by inviting students, faculty, and staff and administrators to be engaged peacemakers, knowledgeable of the many complex issues surrounding violence, safety, and global strife. This year, the theme is racism and the pandemic, who is safe and who is well. Throughout the week, there are a number of sessions aimed at promoting deeper understanding and sustained dialogue about the intersection of these two issues, which is very much at the forefront of all of our lives at the moment. And so we hope that you will attend more of the sessions this week. And given that we recognize the need to center ourselves in this moment, and we are beginning each session with a short mindfulness meditation. So I'm going to ask, before I turn it over to Catherine Bruning, who will lead us in that, I'm going to ask if you could mute your microphones so that all of us can be focused on centering and being mindful of each other. So if you can please mute your microphones. And Dr. Eodice, I don't know if, since you are the host, if you note somebody who's not muted, if you can do that, that would be helpful.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. For each week of the Peacemaker, we'll take a moment to quiet ourselves and engage in a simple meditation. We do so to honor our commitment to being people of peace. We recognize that mindfulness practice strengthens our interconnectedness with each other and fosters compassionate action. We ask you to honor your individual intentions and set communal intentions to ground and guide our time together, and affirm the college's mission to foster justice, advocacy, and peacemaking. So taking a moment to let ourselves arrive, breathe in together, and repeat the intention to yourself. I will slow down. I will pay attention. I will remember to take care of myself. I will stay grounded. I will be flexible. I will move with love. Placing your right hand over your heart, take a moment to set an intention for your presence at this moment. And we invite you to remember those who have been lost due to the pandemic or to racism. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much for leading us in that, Catherine. We appreciate that very much. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to our esteemed Dr. Alex Eodice, who is the chair of the philosophy department. And again, he will lead us in a conversation on shaking our values, moral, legal, and epistemic challenges from the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you, Dr. Eodice. It's all yours.
Thank you, Teresa. I'm very happy to participate in this week's events, even though it's not a very happy world we currently live in. In any case, what I want to do today is to identify I will just admit people as I see them coming in, identify some questions we ordinarily raise about the moral life, about our civic life, about our responsibilities as knowers in the world, and to see how they take on a different and new and more challenging significance during the COVID pandemic. In a moment, I'll share a screen. I don't want to stultify you too much with PowerPoint. I'll try and get through that and get as swiftly as we can and get to a conversation that I hope is fruitful and productive. So I'll just bear with me one moment. I'm going to share this screen, and you should all see that. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
And I will just start this from the beginning. So we call it shaking our values. And here are some questions that I think we ordinarily ask ourselves as moral agents, as citizens, as knowers. What moral obligations do we have, if any at all? Do we have duties and responsibilities to ourselves and to others? How do we balance rights and liberties in a society like ours, where both of those are values? How do we balance those values? And in particular, how do we balance them alongside our sense that we live in a community, our sense of the common good? And how can law accommodate that balance, if indeed it can? What responsibilities do we uniquely have to the most marginalized and least advantaged members of our society? Many of us lead reasonably comfortable lives and often wonder what we can do to help those who don't. And what responsibilities, I think the question of knowing and accepting testimony from others, being informed knowers, is itself a kind of moral responsibility. What responsibilities do we have to be informed citizens, knowers, to understand our own limits, to assess the testimony of others? I think these questions generally puzzle us, but they have certainly taken on new exigency during the COVID crisis, particularly this last point, by the way, when there seems to be what might have seemed several months ago a very unlikely debate. Do we listen to the testimony of medical experts about how we should behave during a pandemic, or do we listen to our politicians? In any case, let's see how this might go. There we are. Whoops. Sorry. I don't know why it's moving so much, but there we are. Let's consider first some moral challenges. And I want to take on these challenges from the perspective of what's called normative ethical theory. Those folks in my class have unfortunately heard too much about the idea of normative ethical theories. So it will be review for some of them, and maybe for some of you an initial acquaintance. A normative ethical theory is one that proposes to be action guiding. It's one that says, here are the standards, here are the criteria for determining what is right and what is wrong. And there are a wide variety of such theories. I'm going to leave out extreme cases like egoism. I should act, excuse me, only for my own benefit, or some form of ultra altruism, that I should act only for the benefit of others. Aside from those extreme cases, there are, I think, three general types of normative theory that standardly inform people's moral sensibilities. And as we go through this, you might think of where you reside, because I think each of these has a kind of intuitive appeal. So one is called consequentialism. You know it perhaps best as utilitarianism, where the moral rightness or wrongness of our actions is based solely on the consequences, good or bad, of those actions. So if actions improve the world in some way, then those actions are moral. If they could have done better, then they're not quite moral enough. If they increase the amount of suffering, let's say, in the world, then they're clearly immoral. But the emphasis here is on the end result and not on intentions, not on deliberations or any other sense of obligation. Then there's something called duty ethics. Kant's theories are most appropriately studied in this regard, where actions are right or wrong in themselves, independent of the consequences, determined to be duties, maybe through rational reflection, through the application of a general and supreme principle of morality. But the point here is that our duties are actions we ought to perform irrespective of the consequences. And then virtue theory, one, as Dr. Stackhouse earlier indicated, I might actually favor, that morally good actions follow from a person's firmly developed character, neither from consequences alone nor from abstract senses of obligation, but in terms of how well we understand what is reasonable, appropriate to do in any given circumstance. And that could vary. It could vary by individual. It could vary by circumstance. So let's just keep those ideas in mind as we work through just these in a little more detail, each of them. So for utilitarianism, the point is to make the world a better place, right? By performing actions that bring about, as is famously stated, the greatest good for the greatest number, or at the very least, refraining from actions that generate worse consequences. We should always strive to maximize good, minimize bad for the greatest number, where no one individual's interest counts any more or any less than anyone else's. This is the strong notion. Excuse me. Just going to take a sip of water here. This is the strong notion of impartiality that defines utilitarianism. In terms of our position in a moral community, no one counts any more or any less than anyone else. That core utilitarian intuition plays a dominant role, I think, in our current health crisis. Many believe that the only way to affect the best result, say health in this case for the greatest number, is through maximal participation in appropriate behavior, wearing masks, quarantining when necessary, engaging in social distancing. But there are some questions we might want to consider. Can we strictly adhere to the utilitarian demand of impartiality? Would we sacrifice ourselves or our own lives or the lives of our loved ones for the sake of maximal distribution of the good? And even if we're not talking about ourselves or our loved ones, are you willing to sacrifice anyone? In the height of the crisis in New York and other states are experiencing very high levels of hospital admittances now. Who decides and how do you decide who gets the ventilator? During the height of the crisis in New York, EMTs had to leave non-COVID patients who otherwise might have been saved for dead in their homes because there wasn't enough room in the hospitals for them and there wasn't enough medical personnel to treat heart attack victims, let's say. Now, such examples illustrate to me that despite our otherwise deeply held utilitarian intuitions, yeah, sounds nice, let's make the world a better place, that there are conflicts with other bioethical concerns that we might have. Let's say about patient autonomy, or concerns that force us under strict utilitarian points of view to accept actions we might otherwise find morally repugnant. No one would desire to leave a sick patient. No one would desire to leave, let's say, an elderly patient to die in an emergency room because we've decided to put younger people on ventilators before the elderly. So a nice view and a common view, and one with a very good intuition, let's make the world a better place. But sometimes it conflicts with other moral senses we might have. Duty ethics gives us a somewhat different perspective. As with utilitarianism, impartiality here is crucial, but from a very different angle. In this case, we have obligations, duties, demands to act in certain ways towards ourselves and others in order to respect and preserve the autonomy of each individual. These obligations are often said to be universal in that they apply to all persons. In Kant's terms, this means we must never use persons merely as a means to ends, even if those ends seem from where we stand to be very good ends, like what might appear to be a better immediate consequence to this particular crisis we're experiencing in this emergency room right now. Each autonomous agent is a seat of uncompromisable value for Kant. So the obligation doesn't shift no matter what the circumstances or goals are. What would we make of bioethical obligations in this case? Can we place relative value on individual lives? Can we place relative value on the life of an elderly person versus a young person? On the life of a Black person versus a white person? Moreover, the duties to others that we may obviously have might conflict with duties to oneself. How are we going to resolve these kinds of questions? Again, I'm raising more questions than I am possibly capable, by the way, of answering. And I don't mean just in terms of the time constraint. I just mean, I don't know that I could answer these questions, but I could raise them. Let's look briefly at virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is about the cultivation of character. According to Aristotle, for instance, the virtues are the conditions for our own well-being, our own happiness, which is broadly construed for him to mean a flourishing life. But they also lead to actions that enable us to live well with others. The moral actions not understood in isolation from developed traits, courage, generosity, justice, fairness, either in terms of bringing about good consequences or in terms of duties. The virtuous person is one who acts wisely and appropriately in response to contingencies and complex circumstances of life. Aristotle's description of what he calls the golden mean is one who knowingly performs actions directed towards the right people, to the right extent, at the right time, in the right way, and with the right aim or the right goal or the right intention. How might such a view aid in understanding bioethical dilemmas? Does it, for instance, provide a better way for us to understand why we come to value the efforts of frontline medical personnel and other essential workers? How should we understand those workers? Let me quickly just say what I mean by that question. Are they just performing dutiful actions? Are they just sort of elements in a utilitarian calculation? Or are they people of courage, people of generosity? Could we praise them if all they were acting dutifully? Don't we hold people who are on the front lines doing what they know they have to do because it is the reasonable thing to do. It is the thing to do towards the right people at the right time in the right way. And that's a demonstration of their generosity, of their courage, of their capacities that others of us might not have. You know, admittedly, we expect people in certain kinds of circumstances to act in ways the rest of us don't. A firefighter runs into a burning building. We may not. That doesn't mean we're cowards. But if a firefighter refused to do it, that might mean something different. I don't want to say much more about ethics. I want to now sort of move on to questions that might center around our civic life, our legal, the legal environment. I'm very consciously trying to steer clear of contemporary political debates and just trying to locate where people might stand on issues generally and then see how they might translate those issues during this COVID pandemic, because it has challenged us again to examine our own civic responsibility and legal authority from several salient perspectives, from law's authority in the prevention of harm and the protection of liberty, to individual rights, to a perspective on the distribution of benefits and burdens in society, and to the values that we might share as a living civic community. So let's look at these. John Stuart Mill, a utilitarian, he did famously argue that the well-being of society depends on maximizing liberty for its individual members. You couldn't have a good society if there were no liberty of thought, no freedom of speech. These were prime values for him. But he is also well noted for expressing the idea that government's authority rests exclusively in the power to limit actions which are harmful to others. Now, we generally tend to think that harm means physical harm, and in the COVID case, it's clear that harm could be suffering from the disease or, God forbid, death from the disease. But Mill's own conception of harm is much broader than mere physical suffering. We can think of psychological and emotional, as well as economic harms. So what happens? And this is a question you've seen, I'm sure. What happens if economic harm or economic harm coupled with psychological damage is calculated to be worse for society than the potential physical harm of the virus alone? Mill's harm principle cuts in both directions. We need somehow to settle. This is another issue, I think, that comes out in any number of ways. I heard from somebody who works in the area, I'm not just making this number up, that it's forecasted that 30% of restaurants in New York City will have closed by the end of this pandemic. That is a huge hit to New York's economy. But not only is it a hit to the economy, individuals clearly suffer. I mean, the people who work in restaurants are often the people who are least advantaged in our society, who have to work as dishwashers, waiters. So it's not an illegitimate question to ask, how do we factor economic harms against potential physical harm? There are those who talk about their individual rights. Now, this denies any significance to the notion that Mill did of the utilitarian notion of what's good. The law exists for people of a libertarian strain simply to protect their liberties, an inviolable right that I have. And the COVID-19 pandemic, we all admit, has issued an unprecedented, certainly in my memory and in some historians' memory, expansion of governmental power, aside from the Civil War, perhaps, limiting individual rights. And the backlash, curiously, has been significant. Most Americans, I think, have voluntarily elected to follow guidelines, and it's a good thing. Many of you probably heard this week that the prediction is perhaps as many as another 200,000 deaths if we proceed the way we're proceeding now. If everyone were to wear a mask, I heard a medical expert just yesterday say, if everyone were to follow the guidelines for isolation, social distancing, mask wearing issued by medical experts, we could conceivably save 100,000 of those lives. And yet, people persist. Fill stadiums with 30,000 people at political rallies. You swim in the Lake of the Ozarks. Have motorcycle jamborees in the Dakotas. And even the Jewish community, but here's where it gets tough, right? The Jewish community in Williamsburg saying, hey, we want to practice our religion. Should people be allowed to engage in large-scale religious services on the basis of this voluntary choice? That's one kind of question. The other is, from a practical point of view, can the government even successfully enforce its restrictions? The Port Authority issued yesterday, some of you may have seen, a fine for not wearing a mask. We have, if you come to New York from one of the states on the dangerous list, you should quarantine for 2 weeks. California was just added. Geez, I might keep California on there anyway, but California was just added to the list. And how are we going to enforce this? Stop every car that comes over the George Washington Bridge? Follow people, make sure they're staying where they say they're going to be staying? So much of it is based on voluntary choice. And so much of it requires that people exercise their individual rights responsibly. Whoop. Seem to have gone backwards. John Rawls in 1973 wrote what was probably, what is probably the greatest work in political theory since the 17th century, A Theory of Justice, where Rawls attempts to reconcile the two perspectives, the more utilitarian perspective and the rights-oriented perspective we just looked at. Rawls argues that in order to secure justice, the principles upon which a society is organized and must continue to be organized, the principles must be fair, in the sense that they must be decided from what he calls a situation of being behind a veil of ignorance, a position that disallows the knowledge of anyone's particular interests or place in society. Now, I think this is particularly poignant in light of our current discussions about race and racism. Is this the best way to derive justice on the basis of that kind of veil? But Rawls, in any case, believed that if we did apply that veil, we would rationally derive two principles. One, the principle of equality, of political rights for all. And two, and importantly, I think, for our current circumstance, the difference principle or the distributive principle. The one that says, if there are inequalities, and there are, that they are tolerable only to the extent that the benefits in society are distributed in such a way so as to benefit the least advantaged without making anyone worse off. So once we have the principles, then we go into real society, we see who's disadvantaged, and we apply the distributive or the difference principle to ensure that the most marginalized and least advantaged of our society are not unduly bearing the burdens of society. Under this view, the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbates existing social inequalities, race, class, where a larger share of the social burden has fallen on those who are already at a disadvantage, further imperiling the equality that must be ensured at the political level. Look at what's going on, all this discussion about voting rights right now. Why is voting so important? So important because it is perhaps our most cherished political right in a democracy. The franchise cannot be compromised. And yet in Texas, people have to drive 100 miles to drop off a ballot in a drop-off box. One drop-off box for several 100,000 people. That's anathema to the Rawlsian idea, for the principle of equality cannot be compromised. We don't make adjustments about that. But if it is compromised, then we need to make adjustments according to the difference principle to ensure its equality. I hope that makes some sense. Finally, there's a view that has come to be called communitarianism, which has its roots in the ancient Aristotelian tradition. It says that neither the modern utilitarian notion of maximizing benefit nor the classical liberal ideal of securing equal rights work, but more in the ancient tradition of natural law and virtue is the idea that we don't live as isolated individuals endowed with rights, nor as simple points of calculation. It's not like we're weighing benefits, pleasure states to you and painful states to me. And instead, we are defined by our social attachments. And that if we understood that, we would have a rational commitment to the common good, not in the utilitarian sense of just maximizing benefit, but in the sense we're all in this business together. So from this perspective, rather than focusing on our difference, we might well ask during this crisis, what ethical values do we share? What sacrifices are we willing to make? How would we choose to share the benefits and burdens to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to enjoy a flourishing life? And I think that's an important general question, to be sure, because there's no kind of immediate answer we can give to that. But as a guiding principle, we ought to hope for a society where everyone can enjoy, by pursuing their goods, a flourishing life. I want to then quickly now, because I want some time for discussion, move on to a final challenge that comes out of this, that I call an epistemic challenge. That word it's a fancy philosophical term for knowledge. So it's a challenge about our responsibility as knowers. Ordinarily we just, commonly think that I'm a container for beliefs. I believe things, I happen upon a world, confirms my beliefs, they must be true. More dangerously, people think whatever I believe must be true. And they don't care about what the world is like. Moreover, we commonly think that concepts like duty and virtue are reserved for moral and political and legal discourse. But it may be that they have equal bearing with respect to ourselves as knowers. What obligations do we have, and what virtues might be cultivated in this regard? There's a theory called virtue epistemology that claims that knowledge is not simply or even primarily a matter of having and assessing beliefs. Instead, it involves having the proper attitudes, cultivating the proper traits, which when activated, give us the best shot of landing on the truth. An example of an epistemic virtue might be something like openness and open-mindedness to new ideas. The contemptuous rejection of ideas simply because they're not yours is a corresponding epistemic vice. So how might this play out? Openness is not infinite, because we can't decide everything for ourselves. we need to recognize also our own limitations. So we rely often on the testimony of others. And to become responsible and fully participatory citizens in a free society, we should have some capacity to distinguish reliable from unreliable testimony. There are certainly differences of opinion. We see this every day. In a field, doctors can disagree with each other, virologists and epidemiologists and social scientists and psychologists. But there's a huge difference between our not being able to adjudicate among those competing theories and the ability to distinguish, okay, I'll say it, bullshit from science. It doesn't take much to know we shouldn't inject disinfectant to treat COVID-19, even if we don't know what therapeutic medicines will treat it. It doesn't take much to know that we shouldn't reject predictive models at all, even if we don't know which model is most applicable. It doesn't take much to know, perhaps most immediately, of most immediate concern to us right now, it doesn't take much to know that we shouldn't reject expert medical testimony about our behavior during the pandemic, wearing masks, washing hands, avoiding crowds, simply because our politicians say otherwise. Even if we don't know the science behind it, we need to be good, reliable judges. Well, I have one concluding comment and then we can get to conversation, I hope. I've resisted taking a stand on any of these conflicts or challenges, but I will put forward the following judgment. Many of our cherished beliefs have been thrown into uncertainty. But I think this crisis, if we emerge better from it, it's because we adopt some kind of guiding principle. And it might go something like this. Whatever moral, civic, and knowledge lessons we take away from experience, we can learn that these are not compartmentalized categories of human life, that the values we hold cross whatever artificial boundaries we've imposed, so that life in a community might best be understood as a coherent unity of our moral, civic, and epistemic virtues. So I think I will end there. Is that okay, Teresa? And maybe you can, I'm going to stop that share, see who's left.
Not
And
many
I welcome
have
any,
left the room. We're all still here.
I welcome any conversation.
So we'll open it up to folks to either, you can, one of two ways. You can either unmute yourself and ask your question or offer a comment, or you can post it in the chat and I'll keep monitoring what's in the chat.
Hi, I just want to say, I know that we can't really control what people do or think. I think from an individual standpoint, to prevent sickness, we should all take matters into our own hands and do what we can, but we can't control other people. So I feel like the people who are at risk should take extra measures. I don't know. It's we can't we can't force people to think differently, and some people act ignorantly and aren't open to conversation, so they'll never change what they think. So I think we can only do what we can, and sometimes it's out of our hands. I don't know. It's just not to be negative or anything. I've been home for the past 7 months, so it's kind of tough, but just wanted to say that.
Yeah, I don't get around much anymore myself, Marcus. It was Marcus, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we can change the way people think, but can we legitimately change the way they act when the consequences of better action might be better? And in changing the way they act, might that be an entry, a small entry into perhaps changing how some people might think? Again, that's a good Aristotelian point, that we act often and actions become ingrained, and that develops thoughts in us. And what I mean by that, in the case of the pandemic, is something very, very, very clear to me. Suppose you have the thought, oh, the government can't tell me, what to do. It can't tell me I should wear a mask. It can't tell me I can't go to a wedding in Williamsburg with 10,000 people. These are my rights. Well, maybe it can prevent you from doing those things because maybe other rights. See, to me, it's not inconsistent with the rights view, right? Not inconsistent with the more individualistic view that other rights take priority. I have a right to safety. You have a right, but you don't have a right to compromise my safety, right? So, there are conflicts of rights all the time in society. Individuals conflict all the time, and often the law has to come in and decide how we resolve those conflicts. And it just says, well, you have to act this way.
Other questions or comments, particularly from our students?
Yeah, please. How about somebody from Philosophy 210 maybe starting the conversation?
I was going to say, maybe you do your method of the cursor over the names and see where it lands.
I am that. You can put your pictures on. Amanda, are you there?
I didn't realize my video was off.
There you go.
Yeah, talking about going back to the whole COVID thing and, an individual's right to safety. As for like people's view on wearing masks and things and saying it's a violation of your individual right, it's more of an egoistic view of saying, I'm going to worry about myself. My safety's fine. So I don't need to wear a mask and things like that. Yeah, that's all I really had. I was just thinking about that while you were talking about egoism.
Yeah, but again, in thinking only about yourself, you might not realize that rights extend beyond yourself. And that sometimes that extension limits even what you can do in a self-regarding way.
So, Dr. Edwards, I have a question.
Yeah.
That your remarks kind of provoked. So, in our society, we have other areas where we don't seem to have this kind of this trouble or this, difficulty with wrapping our with wrapping our minds around the importance of balancing, the individual rights and the responsibility to the community. So, we have we have freedom of speech, but we can all agree that we're not going to yell fire in a crowded theater because we know that that's going to cause harm to others. Or, so then there are examples of that. Or if we, write something in a newspaper that, we're not going to, say falsehoods about someone because that could be, disparaging someone's character. So there are ways in which we can mediate these rights and responsibilities. Why do you think it's so difficult to kind of make that analogy between those kinds of things that we already accept and the kinds of things that seem to be necessary within a public health crisis?
Yeah. Sometimes I'm mystified by it. Sometimes I want to say invincible ignorance, a term that the nuns taught me in grade school. And other times I just think, and Amanda might have been onto it a little bit, that it's a kind of selfishness, that an an overemphasis on the individual breeds. It breeds a kind of political egoism, if you will, where people become blinded to the possibility of understanding that every right has a limit. And that part of what we do in a free society is to test that over and over and over again. In turn, well, we have a court system that does that, but that's why we need, I think, judges to adjudicate those kinds of disputes. But that's what we do in a free society. We can't do anything we want because we claim we're free. We can't assert the superiority of our own selves over the continuance of the community itself. So it's kind of I guess it's kind of a level of ignorance that I find mystifying. Because on the one hand, we all live in a society where those limits are tested time and again, and they develop, and some people are just incapable of seeing that.
Mhm. Thank you for that sobering recognition of our our own limitations as human beings.
Dr. Eodice, would you, I mean, I know we talked a bit about this in class, but would you say, for more clarity, is it more of like do you think this level of apathy is more of a learned trait that is passed down like parent to child, or something that we just kind of are born with?
Well, I'm not sure what I just described, Amanda, was apathy. But I do think apathy is another kind of problem. We can settle into our positions and simply, I don't know, are incapacitated from appreciating the circumstances and difficulties of others. So I don't deny that there is apathy. But I think when we're jolted, even, well, I was going to say even the most apathetic among us, but I don't know. Most of those who are apathetic, I don't know if it would be the most apathetic among us, are jolted out of that, right? I found that statistic about 30% of restaurants closing in Manhattan to be jolting in New York City, rather, to be jolting in any number of ways. I mean, if you combine that with the fact that there's commercial property that's vacant now because, used to be thriving office buildings, and people are working from home, and these big towers have nobody going in and out of them. What's going to happen to that property? What's going to happen to the restaurant industry? But what's going to happen to the people who do wash the dishes in restaurants, who are and who had to, by the way, if they were not the restaurant employees, but other employees, also coming in disproportionate numbers from marginalized segments of our population throughout this crisis, had to ride the subway tracks to pick up our garbage, to essential workers, as they were called. When you see or hear, look at the circumstances of people in that situation, coupled with the economic disaster that's going to happen, coupled with tens of thousands of people in our local community, millions of people in our nation out of work, how does that not jolt you out of apathy? And now, even if you can't do anything about it, we can continue to See, I don't think thinking is a bad thing. So we can continue to think about how we ought to adjust our society to meet the new demands that these economic harms, these real deficits are going to how they're going to affect people. We could think about what we need to do. And I think many apathetic people might be even jolted by looking at those kinds of numbers, by thinking about the plights of certain people, by, as many of us were, for many, many weeks, we saw, right, especially here in New York, every night on the news, some new report about a frontline medical worker, the heroes, and many of us wouldn't want to be in that environment, but we no longer took for granted, what it meant to have a local hospital with an emergency room nearby. Well, gee, I guess they'll just take me there. Well, yeah, they might take you there, but you better make sure they're courageous and generous people there to help you. And you should hope you're not on the list of those who aren't priorities for ventilators. That, how can you be apathetic in those circumstances?
So speaking of
So,
being jolted out of apathy,
yeah,
let me if I may just introduce or extend some of the comments that you made around the racism and the racial inequities that we see. I mean, one of the things that is so evident throughout, particularly this summer, after the murder of George Floyd, was that seemed to be a real inflection point that jolted many people out of maybe not an apathy, but a sense of a real awakening around um, perhaps complicity, silence, general nonchalance regarding racial injustice. And we saw it with the way, I mean, the numbers of people in the streets, the diversity of the people in the streets was unlike anything that we have seen in a generation, even within the civil rights movement. So what do you think, Dr. Eodice, would be I don't know, the kind of the next step from a moral, legal, or epistemic perspective that extends or emerges from that jolting out of apathy around racial injustice that we are living in?
yeah. I did mean, by the way, to indicate at the opening of my remarks that this was a talk that was given before the George Floyd murder. And I thought about, should I actually modify this, but I thought the issues of the pandemic were insufficiently changed, the pandemic. But yeah, I want to say I agree absolutely that somehow our sense of complacency or complicity, depending on your perspective, has been challenged deeply. My own view, because I do favor the idea that we live in a community, and a community is not that's the word I'm looking for. It's not a block thing. It's not a monolith. A community is made by difference. It's made by respect for difference. And here's the challenge. How do we recognize difference, respect it, but at the same time, that's not all a community is, because a community is also something that has a common goal, which I try to suggest here is the goal where everyone in this community has a fair share of the benefits and burdens. Doesn't mean it's going to always be the equal share, but fairness and justice, to my mind, are crucial questions, because in the end, we have to live with each other. And we don't just have to live with each other in the sense of tolerating each other. We have to live with each other in respectful ways. We have to live with each other with the common view that each and every one of us can enjoy a flourishing life in the context of this community. So that is the guiding principle I would have. I guess that's truly extraordinary task is how do we balance all of that in practical ways? And I don't confess or profess. I do neither of those things. To have the answer in this regard. But I think that principle is a reasonable principle. And there might be others who disagree.
Thank you for your willingness to be put on the spot and take that question.
Not at all. I think it's a crucial question. You know, it struck me when George W. Bush, of all people, in his comments on the crisis, said that we are suffering during this pandemic, but the suffering does not fall equally. And it's something we need to pay attention to. It jolted me, I must say. And it's certainly true. We're all suffering to some degree or other. But it's not like that's distributed in some sort of egalitarian way and let's us all take on our little bit of, there are people who are suffering unduly more than they ought to if we value living in this community.
Any other questions or comments from those who are gathered here? Again, checking the chat, I haven't seen anything come up on the chat. I think we can safely assume that you have, yet again, Dr. Eodice, with your profound words and ideas have just, we're sitting with it and taking it all in and thinking about how we can incorporate the challenges that you have presented to us today and for this week of the Peacemaker.
Well, I thank you very much for those kind words. I only aspire to live up to that, but I hope that many of you will take something away from this occasion and think a little differently, perhaps, than you otherwise might have.
So thank you again. Well, this is essentially your class session. So I don't want to sign folks off if that's not your intention. But
I can let them go early, right? Jack Monahan, are you still there? Maybe not.
Yes.
Oh, there. See, there he is. We can safely go, right?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Okay.
All right. Thank you all very much. Thank
Thank
you
you all
again,
for-
Dr. Eodice.
Thanks for your attention. I very much appreciate it.
We appreciate you. Have
Thank
a
you,
wonderful
Professor.
rest of your day.
Have a great day.
Have a great day,
Take care.
Professor.
Have a nice day, Professor Eodice.
Thanks, Gabe.
Thanks again, Alex. You
Oh,
can hit the end record so
Oh,
that it ends that
let
the
me-
recording session.
And then